I was just a broke college student working double shifts at a diner when an elderly man left me something that would change my life forever. What he gave me wasn't money. It was something far more valuable. By the end of this story, you'll understand why kindness always comes back tenfold. If you believe in the power of kindness and want to hear stories that restore your faith in humanity, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. 3 years ago, I was drowning. Not literally, but financially and emotionally. I was barely keeping my head above water. I was 20 years old, a junior in college, and working double shifts at Mel's Diner just to scrape together enough money for tuition. The diner wasn't glamorous. Cracked vinyl booths held together with duct tape, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps, and the permanent smell of coffee and bacon grease that clung to your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. I remember that particular week in October because it felt like the universe was testing me. My tuition payment was due in exactly 14 days, and I was $800 short. $800 might not sound like a lot to some people, but to me it might as well have been $8,000. I was living off ramen noodles and whatever leftovers Mel let me take home at the end of my shift. My feet ached constantly from standing 12 hours a day, and I was carrying my textbooks everywhere because I couldn't afford the bus fare home between my morning classes and evening shift. But here's the thing about working at a place like Mel's Diner. You become part of a strange little family. There was Mel himself, a 60-something guy with a permanent scowl who actually had the biggest heart you could imagine. He'd grumble about everything but never once threatened to fire me when I had to study during slow periods. Then there was Rita, a veteran waitress who'd been slinging coffee since before I was born. She taught me that the secret to surviving in the service industry wasn't just being fast. It was remembering that every customer who walked through that door was carrying their own invisible burdens. I took that lesson to heart. While other waitresses would roll their eyes at difficult customers or rush through their orders, I made it a point to really see people. I remembered that the trucker in booth 3 liked his coffee black with exactly 2 sugars. I knew that the elderly woman who came in every Thursday was lonely and just needed someone to listen to her stories about her grandchildren. My philosophy was simple: treat everyone like they matter because they do. Most days this approach served me well. I got better tips than the other girls, and customers would specifically ask for my section. But on that Tuesday afternoon in October, I had no idea that this philosophy was about to change my entire life. It was a Tuesday around 2 in the afternoon, the deadest time at the diner. The lunch rush was over, and the dinner crowd wouldn't start trickling in for another few hours. I was wiping down tables and stealing glances at my sociology textbook when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up to see an elderly man standing in the doorway, and something about him immediately caught my attention. He was well dressed in a way that seemed out of place at Mel's. A crisp navy suit, polished leather shoes, and a watch that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But his eyes held a sadness that expensive clothes couldn't hide. His shoulders were slightly stooped, as if he was carrying an invisible weight, and when he walked, there was a careful deliberateness to his steps. He chose table 12, the corner booth that hardly anyone ever sat in during day shifts. I grabbed a coffee pot and made my way over, putting on my brightest smile despite my exhaustion. "Good afternoon, welcome to Mel's. What can I get started for you today?" His voice was gentle, cultured. "Just coffee, please. And maybe a slice of that apple pie if you have it." As I poured his coffee, I noticed his hands had a slight tremor. Not from age or illness, but from something deeper. Grief, maybe. I'd seen that look before in my own mirror after my mother died. "Coming right up," I said. But instead of rushing away like I normally would, something made me pause. "First time at Mel's?" He looked up at me with surprise, as if he wasn't used to waitresses making conversation. Yes, actually. I'm just passing through town. He took a sip of his coffee and smiled slightly. My wife used to love places like this. Said they had more character than those fancy restaurants. The way he said used to told me everything I needed to know. She sounds like she had good taste, I said softly. I'll get that pie for you. When I returned with his slice of apple pie, he was looking at a photograph in his wallet, a small, faded picture of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. He quickly tucked it away, but not before I caught the loving way his fingers traced the edge of the photo. She was beautiful, I said, setting down his plate. He looked up at me again, this time with tears threatening to spill over. She was. 43 years we were married. She passed 6 months ago. His voice broke slightly on those last words. I should have walked away then. I had other tables to check on, salt shakers to fill, a dozen other tasks. But something about this man's loneliness called to me. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, sliding into the booth across from him without really thinking about it. What was her name? Margaret. Maggie. He smiled through his tears. She would have liked you. You remind me of her when she was young. Always seeing the best in people. Always making time for a kind word. We talked for 3 hours. 3 hours in a diner where most customers finish their coffee and leave within 30 minutes. He told me about Maggie, about how they'd met at a church social when they were both 19, about their travels, their dreams, their life together. And somehow, without meaning to, I found myself telling him about my own struggles, about losing my mother 2 years earlier, about working to become a teacher because that had been her dream for me, about the constant worry about money and whether I'd be able to finish school. He listened to every word with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. When I mentioned my tuition problem, he didn't offer empty platitudes or quick solutions. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about my goals, my plans for the future, what kind of teacher I wanted to be. The world needs more teachers like you're going to be, he said finally. Teachers who see the whole person, not just a student in a desk. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I'd never had a conversation like this with anyone, let alone a stranger. There was something almost magical about the connection we'd formed over coffee and pie in that little corner booth. As the dinner crowd started filtering in, I knew our conversation had to end. He seemed to sense it too and began gathering his things. Thank you, he said, standing up slowly. I haven't talked like this since Maggie died. You've given an old man a precious gift today. I waved off his thanks, embarrassed. You don't need to thank me. Sometimes we all just need someone to listen. He pulled out his wallet and left exact change for his coffee and pie, $4.37. No tip, which stung a little if I'm being honest, but I understood. Not everyone could afford to tip, especially older folks on fixed incomes. I was about to clear his table when he stopped me. Wait, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a sealed white envelope, thick and official looking. I want you to have this, but promise me something. Don't open it until you get home tonight. Can you promise me that? I stared at the envelope in confusion. Sir, I can't accept. Please, he interrupted gently. It's important to me that you have this. Promise me you won't open it until you're home. Something in his voice made me nod. I promise. He smiled then, the first genuine, full smile I'd seen from him all afternoon. Thank you, Angel. For everything. And then he was gone, leaving me standing there with a mysterious envelope and more questions than answers. The rest of my shift crawled by at a snail's pace. The envelope felt heavy in my apron pocket, and I found myself absent-mindedly touching it every few minutes. Rita noticed my distraction and teased me about having a secret admirer, but I barely heard her. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Maybe it was a thank you note. Maybe he'd left me a $20 or $50 tip out of kindness. The envelope was thick enough that it could contain several bills. By the time I clocked out at 10 p.m., I was practically vibrating with curiosity. The bus ride home to my tiny studio apartment felt like it took forever. I must have pulled that envelope out of my bag a dozen times, turning it over in my hands, but I kept my promise. I wouldn't open it until I was home. Finally, I was standing in my cramped apartment, the envelope in my trembling hands. I tore it open carefully, and what I found inside made my knees buckle. I had to sit down on my bed because I couldn't process what I was seeing. Inside was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, and beneath it, official-looking documents. The letter began, "Dear Angel," and as I read, my entire world shifted. "Dear Angel, I hope you don't mind that I call you that, but that's what you were to me today. My name is Robert Harrison, and I want you to know that our conversation this afternoon saved my life in ways you'll never fully understand. For 6 months since Maggie passed, I've been drowning in grief and despair. I've been questioning everything the foundation Maggie and I built together, the scholarships we've awarded, whether any of it really matters anymore. Today, sitting in that diner with you, I remembered why Maggie and I started the Harrison Educational Foundation in the first place. It was to help young people like you, people with dreams and determination who just need someone to believe in them. Your kindness, your genuine care for a grieving stranger, reminded me that there is still goodness in this world worth fighting for. I had to stop reading because my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't make out the words. The Harrison Educational Foundation. I'd heard of it. It was the largest private scholarship foundation in our state, responsible for sending hundreds of students to college every year. And this man, this lonely customer I'd served coffee and pie, was Robert Harrison. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Underneath his letter was a complete scholarship application, already filled out with my information, my grades, my essay about wanting to become a teacher. Somehow, in the span of our 3-hour conversation, he'd gathered everything he needed to know about me. The scholarship covered everything. Full tuition, books, living expenses, everything I needed to finish my degree. $45,000 total. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. More than my family had ever had at one time. I cried until I had no tears left. I called the foundation the next morning, certain it had to be some kind of mistake or cruel joke. But it was real. Robert Harrison had personally approved my scholarship, and all I had to do was sign the paperwork. That scholarship didn't just pay for my education. It changed the entire trajectory of my life. I graduated debt-free with my teaching degree and immediately went to work in one of the most underserved school districts in the state. I wanted to give back, to be for my students what Robert Harrison had been for me. Someone who saw their potential and believed in their dreams. Over the years, I saved every penny I could and started my own small scholarship fund for working students. It wasn't much, maybe enough to help 1 or 2 kids each year. But it was my way of honoring what Robert had done for me. 5 years after that life-changing afternoon at Mel's Diner, I was eating lunch at a small cafe near my school when I noticed our young waitress. She was probably around the same age I'd been, juggling her serving tray while trying to study from a textbook propped behind the coffee machine. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, but she still smiled at every customer and remembered their preferences. When I was ready to leave, I asked her about her studies. Turns out she was in her final year of nursing school but struggling to pay for her final semester. The conversation felt like déjà vu. Here was another young woman with big dreams and limited resources, working herself to the bone to achieve them. I left her an envelope that day. Inside was information about my scholarship fund and a note that read, "Kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you spend it." Someone once told me that, and now I'm passing it on to you. But the real revelation came later, when I decided to research Robert Harrison more thoroughly. What I discovered took my breath away. His wife Maggie hadn't just loved diners. She'd worked as a waitress to put herself through college back in the 1960s. The Harrison Educational Foundation was built on the belief that everyone deserves a chance to pursue. I found articles about the foundation, interviews with past recipients, and stories about the thousands of students who've been helped over the years. But what moved me most was finding Robert's obituary. He'd passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 years after our meeting, and the inscription on his headstone bore the same quote Maggie had lived by. "Kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you spend it." I visited his grave last month, bringing flowers and a letter I'd written telling him about all the students I'd taught, all the lives that had been changed because of his generosity. As I stood there, I realized that what he'd given me that day wasn't really about the money at all. It was about understanding that we're all connected, that one person's kindness can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. Today, I teach 5th grade in a Title I school where most of my students qualify for free lunch. Every morning when I look at their faces, some eager, some tired, some carrying burdens too heavy for their young shoulders, I remember that Tuesday afternoon at Mel's Diner. I remember that everyone who walks through our doors, whether it's a diner or a classroom, is carrying invisible struggles and dreams. The Harrison Educational Foundation has now helped over 1,000 students pursue their education. My small scholarship fund has grown too, helping dozens of working students over the years. And every single one of those success stories traces back to a conversation between a lonely widower and an overworked waitress who decided to see each other as human beings worthy of kindness and respect. That's the real lesson Robert Harrison taught me that day. Kindness isn't just about being nice. It's about recognizing the humanity in others and responding with love instead of indifference. It's about understanding that we never know what battles people are fighting or what dreams they're nurturing. And sometimes the smallest acts of genuine care can change the entire course of someone's life. This story proves that kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way back to you. If this touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, you never know how one small act of kindness might change someone's entire life. Subscribe for more stories that will restore your faith in humanity, and let me know in the comments. What's the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you?